I'm very pleased. If you're here, you're obviously interested in this subject that I have to tell about, and it's something that I've been traveling the state with for a couple of years. I was blessed to get a commission from the Indiana Historical Society in the year 2004. And together with the Storytelling Arts of Indiana, they put together this program called Sharing Hoosier History Through Stories. Sharing Hoosier History Through Stories. It's a regular program where they hire storytellers in the state to bring to life some archival material or an exhibit that's going to be at the Indiana Historical Society. And I was lucky enough to get the commission to help highlight the publication of this beautiful biographical dictionary. That's what we librarians like to call it. A biographical dictionary called Skirting the Issue, Stories of Indiana's Women Artists. And these women skirted the issue. By researching this story and spending time at the Indiana Historical Society in the center, a beautiful building facility up there, an amazing library. I hope you sometime get a chance to go up there and spend some time. But of course, to do my research, I had to visit Brown County quite a little bit and read lots of the books. And a lot of these books were owned already by my father, who's a great fan of the Brown County artists and have lots of friends who are influential and know quite a little bit about the artists. So I was able to borrow these books from him. But this society gave to me so that I could pick who would I highlight from this very full dictionary of biographies. Well, I was wise enough to choose 3 women from the Brown County Artist Colony. And my talk is about Ada Walter Schultz, Alberta Rem Schultz, and Marie Goth. And when I was studying them and finding out about the era in which they lived and worked and their lives, amazing and sometimes scandalous intersections revealed themselves to me among their lives. And so my presentation tonight is not so much the type of storytelling you might see where somebody tells a folk tale or rewrites a literary story and tells it in character and voice. Mine is more of what we librarians like to call a book talk, where we highlight or bring to life elements within a book to help a person see what the book holds and hopefully invite them to then check it out from the library or to buy the book themselves. And this book has already won 2 awards. It won an award from the Indiana Center for the Book and from independent book publishers. And it is an incredible work. We do have the book here at the library, I believe in reference copies only. But I do hope that after the program, you'll come up and take a look within this book or visit the Indiana Room to see it more yourself or be inspired to buy your own. So I chose well, and in order to tell this story, I'll be using occasional quotes because why not hear the voices of these people? They're the ones the story belongs to. And of course, we have to try to understand what Brown County was like 100 years ago, a very different visit than one you might take today, but it still has that peaceful valley that the natives, the locals, called Brown County and still call it. It still has that countenance that people discovered. In fact, Peaceful Valley was first visited by Adolph Schultz, a very well-known and famous landscape artist, and T.C. Steele. They were some of the first to make their way from their homes in Wisconsin and Chicago and make their way on the train. The train would only take them, though, as far as Indianapolis, and then they had to take horse and wagon or horseback to find their way into Brown County, and they discovered this artist's destination. And Adolph Schultz, who features in our stories quite a little bit tonight, I want to read a quote to you, a quote that he gave when he returned to his other artists. This is what he said he discovered of Brown County over 100 years ago. I drove through Brown County on a horse and buggy, spending several days on a tour of investigation. I was never before so thrilled by a region. It seemed like a fairyland with its narrow, winding roads, leading the traveler down into the creek beds, through water pools, and up over the hills. Picturesque cabins here and there seemed to belong to the landscape, as did the people who lived in them. All this country was enveloped in a haze. A sense of peace and loveliness I'd never before experienced came over me, and I felt that I had found our ideal sketching ground. And he is one of the founders of the Brown County Artists Colony, something that was technically developed in 1907, and we are celebrating their 100-year celebration of the Brown County Artists Colony all this year. Now, T.C. Steele and Adolph Schultz had a little easier going when in 1905, the Illinois Central Railroad kindly lay a track further on from Indianapolis through the northwest corner of Brown County and put a railroad station right there in Helmsburg, the Helmsburg Station. And so now, folks from Adolph and T.C. Steele's, the Palette and Chisel Club up in Chicago, all those men that belonged to that club, could make it a little easier into the county. But they still had to get from Helmsburg into Nashville. And nobody describes the arduous journey that was to be met better than T.C. Steele's second wife, Selma. This is her memoirs, The House of the Singing Winds. And in it, she describes the wagon ride that all of these artists had to endure to get from that comfy train ride into Nashville proper. This is Selma Steele from The House of the Singing Winds. We took the train to Helmsburg, and from there we drove by hack to the county seat of Nashville. Twilight was gathering as we started on this drive over a road of mud deeply rutted and with shelves of rocks. I was long in forgetting the horror I felt on this first drive into the county. The road wound in and out of valleys, and the hills seemed dangerously high, and the horses were constantly whipped to keep up to a certain pace. At times they stumbled going over the rocky road, and then again, because of the deep mud, they seemed to experience great difficulty in climbing out over the hills. The vehicle kept rocking back and forth, and I wondered how the horses were managed so that they kept on their feet, and how the travelers were kept from being thrown out. And when I asked the driver if this had ever happened, he said, "Oh, yes, ma'am. This same hack turned over last Saturday night." So this was the danger that they still had to make this road, this lack of road, down into Nashville. But once they got to Nashville, the other thing that helped the artist colony to form was the fact that some very wise businessmen in Nashville provided a place for these visitors, tourists and artists alike, to stay. And so the Pittman Inn and the Ferguson House were a place where an artist could go for room and board, so that once they made it there, they'd have a comfortable place to stay. And of course, many of the cabins were available for rent as well. And so with the location and now a bit more ease getting there and some place to stay, and I guess the Pittman Inn was quite famous for its board, 3 meals a day, a table overladen with good food for these artists who had been out trekking the wilderness for their landscapes. And so the artist colony was formed, and T.C. Steele and Adolph Schultz are often given the credit for that, of course. And while Adolph Schultz was an excellent landscape artist, I think the best thing the man ever did was to bring his wife, Ada Walter Schultz, to Nashville. And it took a little while. It wasn't until the summer of 1908 when he and Ada and their teenage son, Walter, arrived at the Helmsburg station, and they made that dangerous journey by hack down to the seat of Nashville. And there she stood, the summer of 1908, stretching out before her. How would she spend that summer? Well, before I tell you how she spent that summer, I want to tell you just a little bit about her. She had talent from early on, and it was evident to her family, her mother, her grandmother. And so they moved from their Terre Haute home into Indianapolis, and she attended Shortridge High School. And she just goes on and on, both in Rachel Perry's book here, Children from the Hills, and in quotes from it in Skirting the Issue, about the wonderful schooling she got at Shortridge High School. And she did very well there, and her mother decided that the only way to do something well was to put everything else aside and focus on that. And that is what she did for her daughter, Ada. She decided to give this daughter of hers the support to find the time and the place to become the artist that she wanted to be. In Shortridge High School, she already learned the hard lesson that women have to learn in order to skirt the issue 100 years ago, the social norms that would keep them in the kitchen and keep them from the daylight hours that are needed to become a professional artist. These women had to skirt those social norms and find their own time and place. And already as a teenager, Ada makes it clear. She says, "As I'd promised to have dinner ready by the time Mama returned from town, I thought by now I'd better lie aside my paintbrush and betake myself to the kitchen, and I did so rather unwillingly. I cannot say that at all times I'm very fond of cooking. It is just as I take a notion. In fact, I am notional about all kinds of work, and happened at this news I was not in a humor for cooking. I do wish there could be some kind of game invented by which the girls could go off and have an excuse to go all day and get out of work and out of running all the errands, as the boys do. But of course, since the girls are naturally more obedient and more thoughtful and careful about home duties, they have to do what the boys always get out of doing." So early on, she'd learned that there were times when she would have to set aside her paintbrush and do the work that was needed first and foremost. Well, with the support of some scholarships and some experiences she had and the support of her mother, she was able to go to the Art Institute of Chicago after high school. And her mother moved there with her to make this happen. And she was at the Art Institute of Chicago for 4 years training. This is remarkable for a woman in that era to have that long in art school and the training. And this was because of her talent and also because of the support she had from her family and from her own successes. She never graduated from art school. She said, "The idea of graduation from art never seemed consistent to me. You don't graduate from art." And so it was at one of the summer sketching classes there at the Art Institute of Chicago that she met Adolf Schultz. He was one of the leaders of that summer outing. And well, one thing led to another, and the courtship bloomed, and they fell in love and were married. And Adolf Schultz, this landscape artist, and his new wife, Ada Schultz, seemed to be a perfect match in their art and their love for it. And they honeymooned in Europe, a year in Paris and Berlin, studying the museums and taking classes and soaking in all the culture of Europe in that area. But in 1895, Ada Walter Schultz became pregnant with young Walter, and they came back to the States and settled in Wisconsin. And it was again that Ada made the conscious decision to set aside her paintbrush and raise young Walter. And though she sketched the baby on occasion, she did not paint for a good 10 years. She supported her husband, Walter, in his career. And there were many social obligations that came to a couple who were renowned artists and favored in the community. And then there was the raising of Walter. When he was about 10, she decided that maybe she could divide her day up a little differently. And so she started doing her housework in the morning and painting in the afternoon and doing less and less of the social obligations that she said women didn't realize ate up so much daylight hours. So she was cutting away at that and painting more. And young Walter, two parents who are famous artists, or soon to be famous artists for Ada, but Adolf was already renowned. Obviously, he had talent, and he had two great teachers. And so he became very skilled himself. And he would spend many hours out with his father, Adolf. They would hunt together and fish and seek out landscapes to paint. And while they were in Wisconsin, there was a few times when all three of them had paintings on display at galleries or exhibits. So they were quite a trio, the Schultzes. But in 1908, the three of them left Wisconsin for the summer, and there was Ada standing on the front porch of the Pittman Inn. Adolf and Walter were already off down the road, seeking out their own view to paint there in Brown County. But Ada, she saw the beauty of Brown County. Who could not? But she also saw the beauty of the people of Brown County. She saw the mixture of hard living and beauty in the faces of these natives, of the locals of Brown County. And while some artists didn't bother to get to know them or to seek them out, Ada definitely sought them out. She wanted to paint them in this setting. For while she'd been at school, she'd been told by more than one instructor that she painted children well, and this was indeed the case. Ada Walter Schultz spent her sunlit hours out in the meadows and along the creek beds with the people of Brown County. And they took to her immediately. Well, first off, they already loved her husband, Adolf, and she was welcome as well. And she just had a personality. They called her the kindly artist with the gentle eyes. And people would sit for her willingly. Now, sometimes she had to pursue them a little bit. There's a story of about one boy who was just walking down the street towards home, and she followed him home in order to ask his mother if he could sit for her. And of course, Miss Ada's wish was granted. But there's a story of another child who was not so easily convinced. He didn't want to sit for Miss Ada because he was desperate to see the cow that had died in the night in the neighbor's field. But he was promised that if he would sit well for Miss Ada, he'd be able to go and see the dead cow. Such was the entertainment at different times. But Ada, she had such relationships with people. In fact, she was one who early on befriended Grandma Barnes, who is a quite a renowned, infamous figure in Brown County. There's a picture in the book that some of you may have seen at the Brown County Public Library. This is Ada holding the rooster with the dangerous talons, and this is little Grandma Barnes, a little more feisty than her size. And while you can only sort of get an idea from your distance there in your seats, it's my hope that you'll get a closer look at that later. But she was someone who was easily befriending all these people. And as a result, that summer, she had her most productive time of her career. 7 canvases painted in that year, in that summer alone. And Ada and Adolf would continue to come summer after summer. It's one of my favorites. Painting every summer. And she was so productive when she was there, and she found her own niche in Nashville. Her notoriety was growing. The accolades were flowing in from critics. She was being accepted for galleries and juried exhibits, and people were buying her work. And she was doing as well, perhaps, as her husband Adolf, which I'm sure may have had trouble setting at times and may have been part of things to come. But they were doing so well, the both of them, and they enjoyed Nashville so much that after 10 years of commuting between Wisconsin in the winter for Walter's schooling and Nashville for the summer, in 1917, they bought some land on the northeast side of Nashville at a place they built a studio and home they called Lizard's Rest. And I believe it's still standing. That's what a person told me recently, although I haven't seen it. Now, Lizard's Rest would be the setting where they would live in Brown County in Nashville year-round, something that they fit into easily because they were already so welcomed by the community, so well known, and they became easily a part of the fabric of that community. And this idyllic life at Lizard's Rest would have continued, except that in 1918, tragedy would come to the Schultzes, for their beloved son Walter was overseas in World War I. Now, he survived trench warfare, but he volunteered to stay on during armistice. And when he volunteered to stay on, he was out traipsing the countryside, seeing those same museums that he'd heard his parents talk so much about, when he contracted diphtheria, the same thing that had killed his grandfather, killed young Walter. And when the news came to the Schultzes in December of 1918, it absolutely tore them apart. The news hit them so strangely, it seems to me. It seemed to draw them apart instead of bringing them closer together. And they foolishly blamed each other for the loss of their son. And as they struggled to heal individually, they worked in the community on their own projects. Little by little, Adolf began to teach again, and he started taking the Sunday painters out as he usually did. And Ada, she helped found in 1919. She helped set up the Brown County Public Library, started organizing its collections. She was one of the women who helped with that. And she was a Christian Scientist, so she found solace in her faith and started having regular meetings in her home. But of course, she found solace in the painting that she continued to do of the children and the people and the farmyard pets of Brown County. And Ada and Adolph continued to do things together as well. They actually helped in 1926 to found the Brown County Art Gallery Association, but they never did find their way back to each other. And maybe they would have, except that in 1922, Adolph invited a student to come and live at Lizard's Rest with him, something that he would do frequently throughout the rest of his life. But unfortunately, this student was a 30-year-old divorcee named Alberta Rem Miller, and she brought with her her little 3-year-old daughter, Emily. And over the time that she lived at Lizard's Rest as a student of Adolph's, an affinity grew between the two. Adolph was hurting, and yet here was this vulnerable, needy student that hung on his every word. And Ada was perhaps hard to reach in those days. And so this Alberta came into their lives. And in 1924, Adolph left Lizard's Rest with Alberta, and the two of them moved just down the road in Nashville to a little house that still stands on the west side of the public library. And Ada, left alone at Lizard's Rest, could not come to grips with the loss of her 30-year marriage, and she could not grant him the divorce. And so for 2 years, Alberta and Adolph lived in that house while Ada wrestled with this change in her life. So I want to leave Ada for a moment there in Lizard's Rest in 1924. Before we realize what she did from that time on, I want to move quickly to Alberta, for I fear you are gathering ill will about her, as did most of Nashville. For they loved Adolph and Ada, and they blamed Alberta for driving them apart. And there was much scandal and talk in Nashville about the role Alberta played in the breakup of Adolph and Ada. And it didn't sit well when she was just down the road in this house with him while poor Ada was at Lizard's Rest. And it also didn't help that Alberta was just a bit of an odd person. In her childhood, she didn't have this wealth of talent that Ada had. She actually thought she'd be a pianist, but she had hearing troubles that meant she wouldn't probably pursue that. And so she started painting. And she wasn't somebody who went to one school and spent many years studying painting. She was a perpetual student. She dabbled from school to school to school, finding her way, learning a bit here, learning a bit there. And at one point, she got married and moved to Texas with her husband. But soon after the divorce, when little Emily was 3, she left Texas and came back to her family home in Indianapolis, where her parents still were, and she lived with them just a little while. But this is the thing I really like about Alberta. She heard about Brown County as an artist's destination, and in 22, she got on that train, just Alberta and little Emily, and in that era, just the two of them headed down to the Helmsburg station and made that dangerous journey down that rocky, shelfy road to not the Pittman Inn, not the comforts of the Pittman, not the Ferguson house. She rented a cabin, a very primitive cabin, owned by another artist in the colony, Mary Murray Vawter. So she was staying at the Vawter cabin, and she was there, and she didn't know Adolph. She was seeking out a teacher, someone to study from, as she did all her life. And she heard about Adolph and started going probably on the Sunday outings with him and started learning, and he was the one that invited her into the house. An affinity grew. Who's to say? So Alberta was there, and Alberta, just to tell you a little bit more about her, a friend described her as the most naive person alive. His friend. She seemed unaware of the animosity that her rapport with Schultz was generating. She was bright, but unsophisticated. A relative who once lived with the Schultzes described Alberta as a high-powered battery of intelligence with no emotional stability, and as a woman with an accumulation of strange energies. So obviously people just couldn't quite put their finger on it. But it didn't help also that as Alberta lived with Adolf, and in fact, in 1926, 2 years after Adolf left with Alberta, 2 years later, finally, Ada was able to come to grips with the end of her marriage, and she granted the divorce to Adolf. And a month later, Adolf and Alberta were married, and soon after that, he adopted Emily. And so over the years when she lived there with Adolf, in the winters, they would go down to Florida, and they'd come back in the rest of the year to Brown County. And while down in Florida, Adolf and Alberta became members of a fringe religious group called the I Am Movement, a group that believes in successive reincarnations on the pathway to higher truths. And this I Am movement was all well and good for Ada and Alberta, but the trouble was that when she come back to Brown County, she tried to share these truths with everyone in Nashville, and that didn't go over well. Her second cousin said, instead of keeping her mouth shut, she wanted to give this truth to everybody in Brown County. It was not well received. It was just one more thing to add fuel to the fire for people. The other thing that made Alberta a little difficult to fit into the artist colony was that she was never sure of her own right to be an artist and a painter. She was always giving others the credit for any success she had. And no one ever heard when she had a painting bought. She didn't tell. When she had a painting accepted for juried exhibit, it wasn't big news. And so people maybe didn't know how successful she was as an artist. And then she was always giving her husband Adolf the credit for any successes she had. She was a bit of a mimic. She would paint beside him, whether in their studio home together or out in the landscapes. They'd have their easels beside each other, and she would paint what he was painting. And so maybe this inability to claim her own made her a little bit of an outsider. But she admits it. She says, I could never have accomplished what I have if it had not been for his help and encouragement. I could never evade his overwhelming influence. His style is my style, and it's quite obvious to anyone who sees our landscapes, even for the first time, that his works are perceptibly superior. Well, perhaps they were, but let me show you just a couple of them here and remind you that if you want to see one, in the Memorial Union, across from the Frangipani Room, I believe, is one of Alberta Rem Schultz's landscapes. And she was an artist in her own right, but maybe was a little soft-spoken about it. And here is a photo of young Emily and Adolf and Alberta. And Alberta was just a misfit in Nashville for many reasons. But we'll leave Alberta there by Adolf's side, painting as she would for decades by his side. And we'll move on to another thing that Alberta did that was very, very good for Nashville. Alberta was childhood friends with Marie Goff up in Indianapolis. And so when Alberta was in Nashville that first time in the cabin, she invited Marie Goff to come to Nashville. Now maybe Marie would have made it there on her own. Maybe she would have become a member of the Brown County Artist Colony in some other way. But Marie Goff was invited by Alberta, and we need to remember that and give Alberta credit for that. But Marie, let me tell you about her. She had talent from early on, obvious to everyone, sketching, drawing, everywhere she went. She went to Manual Training High School so that she could get the great art schooling that they had there. And she was so talented that she was told by those around her, teachers, that she would be a great artist someday. But in the same breath, she was reminded that it's hard for women to succeed in this profession. But she got scholarships, and she had a family that supported her in amazing ways. Her younger sister, Genevieve, 3 years her younger, they were best friends, inseparable, but Genevieve had painting talents as well. But the family chose to focus their financial and moral support on Marie. And Genevieve, the younger sister, became a school teacher, an elementary school teacher in Indianapolis. But let me tell you about Genevieve. Every week, Genevieve Goth sent some of her weekly salary to her sister Marie in New York, because Marie ended up at the Art Students League of New York. And Marie studied there for 10 years because of her own success there and the work that she did and the paintings she sold while at school, but mostly because of this financial support from her beloved mother and father and Genevieve. Now, somebody else she met at the Art Students League of New York was very influential to Marie. His name was Vijay Cariani. Vijay Cariani, an Italian-born painter. She saw him at the Art Students League, and this is what she writes about Vijay. Everyone called him Kari, and what a wonderful person he was. I remember the first time I saw him standing at the end of the hall. He was surrounded by girls. He was very handsome, and his coloring was vivid, as was his personality, and he had great charm, though he was not conscious of it. I believe I fell in love with him at once, as everyone did, and somehow we were drawn together. And they became great friends. He would call her up and he'd say, "What are you doing?" And she'd say, "Nothing in particular." And he'd say, "Let's do that together." And they'd traipse all around New York, visiting the different cultural events. And this time together ended when Vijay Cariani, an Italian-born painter, joined the World War I effort as an American soldier. And while he was over in Europe, Marie Goth had to leave school in New York and come back to Indianapolis to take care of her mother, who was ailing from angina. And so they corresponded through letters. But when Vijay Cariani came back from the war, he survived trench warfare. But what he saw changed him. He was disturbed and hurt psychologically by what he'd seen at war. And the entire Goth family surrounded him and wanted to help him heal. The father tried by getting Vijay a stone carving job in Indianapolis. And maybe over time, things would have gotten better for Vijay. But the thing that really did the trick was that invitation from Alberta. The invitation was just to Marie. And Marie came on that train by herself down to the Helmsburg station. And she too made that difficult journey by wagon down to the cabin that Alberta had rented. And there she stood with her little suitcase on the front porch of that primitive cabin, and she remembers thinking, oh, it was so bare, and she saw that the mattress was just filled with corn shucks and did not look conducive to slumber. But slumber was not the point. For these two women, in that setting, in that time, in that place, were able to do what very few women in that time could do. They were able to go out into the wild, into nature, and walk by themselves freely, something the social norms did not permit for everyone. But they dressed in these things they called Boy Scout shoes, hiking boots that allowed them to walk through the waters of Greasy Creek without getting their feet wet. And they had their khaki skirts and their khaki blouses, and they had a wagon that they pulled little Emily in, and they carried all their stuff out, and they sought their own view of the world, their own place to paint. And she writes back to her family what it was like. During the day, Alberta, little Emily, and myself walked the dusty road down the hill, down through the town of Nashville to the Greasy Creek Road. Then we settled down by the roadside to sketch. And when the sun begins to sink in the west, we put little Emily in her wagon and carry our paint box, easel, and camp stool. We trudge wearily home, and upon reaching the cabin, we're almost too tired to fix supper, and poor little Emily falls asleep in the corner. And this is how they spent their days. And on the second weekend there, Genevieve Goth, the younger sister of Marie, comes on that train and visits the women there in Brown County. And I've already given you a glimpse of how generous Genevieve is. But this is really remarkable. Marie tells about it in a letter home. My dear sister Genevieve came down to visit, And Sunday morning, we were sitting on a log facing north, and Genevieve said, "How would you like it if I bought a little place here for the family summer home?" I was so delighted, I hardly knew what to say. "How would you like it if I bought a little summer home for us?" Well, she was thrilled, and the father came down then on the train, and the three of them traipsed around Brown County looking for the cabin that they would purchase, and they found it. It still stands on the side of Highway 135, which at that time was not paved and just muddy wagon tracks. But it was a little cabin, and when they saw it, it had 4 rooms, each with a door leading out, and one wall on the outside was covered with picturesque pink roses, and they fell in love with it at once, and Genevieve, with her teacher's salary, purchased the cabin for the family. And they spent all winter of 1922 making furniture and finding pieces to put in the home. And in the spring of 1923, they loaded up and came to Brown County, the whole Goth family and Vijay Karyani. And they all loved it so. Studying in the studio, out in the landscapes, but when the summer was over, it was decided that Vijay would stay behind and live year-round there in the studio cabin. And this is what changed Vijay's life. And he had some of his best work, of course, in Brown County. Well, Marie's mother passed away soon after, and she decided to live full-time in Brown County. And when Vijay heard that Marie was coming to live, he left the cabin. He did not want to be indiscreet. He took up residence in the chicken coop so that nobody would give her a bad reputation, for they were not married. But he didn't live there long. Don't worry too much about him. He started building his own studio cabin, which still stands on that property. And in between the two is the gazing pool that he helped to build in between the 2 studio cabins. And this is just what I love about Vijay Karyani, as he loved Marie so very much, and he loved their life, and he wanted her to succeed. So he became the wife in the equation for that era. This is what people said Kari did. They said, Kari took care of her. He did all the gardening, and I heard that he did all the cooking in her home. The way I understand it, he lived in his studio, which had no kitchen, and she in her home. They ate their meals together in her cabin, and he was a very gentle and refined man, and they were of a vintage that they were discreet. But you couldn't help but see her love for him when they were together, and I don't think they could have been closer if they had been married. And another friend says assuredly, "Oh, Marie and Kari were lovers. Yes, oh yes, it was accepted, well known, and some even thought they were married." In fact, the Brown County Democrat, the newspaper, mistakenly identified Marie once as Mrs. Vijay Karyani of Nashville, but their marriage was never to be. One said, a close friend, "I think Marie was interested in marrying Kari, and he was in love with her, but he was a devout Catholic and wouldn't marry out of his religion, and she had been raised Christian Scientist." So they were never to be married, but there they were, side by side. She often said, "I never realized how much he did for me." And it was often said of him that he could not open his mouth without saying the word Marie. He was so in love. And there they spent their years in their side-by-side studio homes. And Genevieve Goth would come to visit, and she fell in love with one of Vijay's friends, one of the other artists in the colony, Carl Groff. And she married him and became Genevieve Goth Groff. And there they were, these friends and these sisters, and they would travel the hills of Brown County, and they'd come home exhausted, and they'd sit down to one of Vijay's spaghetti dinners and one of his homemade apple pies, and this was their idyllic life. And so I leave Marie right there as I begin now to conclude their stories. And I'll start with Alberta. She had decades painting there by Adolf. And as you'll remember, she had a rough time of it in the community. And things didn't really get any better for her at any time soon. Her hearing decreased regularly, and she had a hearing aid, but she wouldn't wear it. And so I can't help but feel that some of the dissonance between people and herself had to do with the the fact that she was trying to read their lips, and maybe there were some misunderstandings. But it also didn't help that her daughter Emily was a very difficult child. People said of her that Emily could be a delight, but that the mother-daughter relationship was disastrous. And unfortunately, Emily was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. And you got to give Adolf and Alberta credit. They tried to raise Emily themselves there, but they just couldn't handle her. And so she was institutionalized and lived in an institution until she died in 1970. Now, the other thing that happened to Alberta is she herself was institutionalized for about 4 months up in Indianapolis after having a nervous breakdown. But she recovered from it, and she came back to live there with Adolf, and they hired people from the community to do all of their cooking and cleaning and gardening, so they truly could devote their time to being professional artists. And she did sell many of her paintings and have many of them accepted. But in 1963, when Adolf was 93 years old, he passed away. She was 71, 20-some years his younger. The cloak of acceptance that had been over her when he was alive was lifted. And there she was, 71 years old, deaf and alone, and still people blamed her for the breakup of Ada and Adolf so long ago. Member of the literary club and the gardening club, but still there were some who felt her a pariah in the community. But many, many, her neighbors took care of her and appreciated her. And she always had nature. She said, her friends said that she found solace in nature. And when Alberta painted, a friend said, she quieted her emotional stuff and got to her spiritual qualities, and her work was marked with some sort of serenity she found in nature. They said that she revered all life, even the existence of the ants and bees, and for her there was much in nature to admire and learn. And she had this in common with Marie, and it's what held her together until she died in 1980, 10 years after her daughter. She died at age 88. Now, Marie there with Vijay Karyani had decades working. Her productive life as an artist is amazing to me, and probably one of the better off careers, well-to-do in this book. Her awards list was pages long when she did die, but she did have these years with the foursome, Carl and Genevieve and Marie and Vijay. But unfortunately, as some of you may know, Carl Graf died way too soon in 1947, I believe, leaving Genevieve devastated. And Genevieve moved in with Marie then, and they comforted each other and were together, of course. But then Genevieve died before Marie, and then 8 years later, Vijay Karyani passed away. Leaving Marie alone? No, because the people of Nashville surrounded her and cared for her, and she continued to paint portraits. At age 88, she had 2 portraits accepted for juried exhibit at age 88, but she didn't live to see them on display. She was bitten by a brown recluse spider, and it made her so ill that they believe it's what made her fall down a flight of steps in her home, and she died from head injuries from that fall. But she left the bulk of her $600,000 estate. Woman artist, Indiana, $600,000 estate. She left the bulk of it to the Brown County Art Guild in that they keep a permanent museum or exhibit that would house her works, Genevieve's, Carl's, and Vijay Karyani. This was her way of thanking them for all their support and keeping their work alive as well. And the Brown County Art Guild has kept that promise beautifully, and I hope that you'll go there, especially during this year of celebration and this month, and go up to that second floor, that permanent home where some of these works are on display. Maybe you've been there already, and remember that this was her gift that she gave to those that helped her find her time and place to paint. But we conclude with Ada, my favorite. I really want one of her paintings. I just love her work so very much. I think there's one for sale in Zionsville soon for about $85,000, $95,000. So I don't think I'll be getting it anytime soon. But Ada, we left her in 1924. Adolf had walked out, Alberta and Adolf just down the road. How would she handle it? What would it mean to her work and her career? Her great niece says it best. Aunt Ada did not die of a broken heart. She painted up a storm after the divorce from Uncle Adolf. She didn't have to do the laundry or the cooking for him. She could just paint, and she did. If she was grief-stricken, she was certainly working it out. And in 1924, with the maestro of landscapes out from under her roof, she painted landscapes, lots of them, and really well. And she had very productive years, 24, 1925, 26, when she finally granted the divorce, 27. But in 1928, she fell ill. She'd been feeling poorly for a while. Her friends noticed that she was vomiting blood, and they worried that she had cancer. But because she was a Christian Scientist, she did not go to the hospital. But a Christian Scientist practitioner did come down from Indianapolis and stay with her in the home. And she died in 1928. I have to remember that she had several decades of productive work, but I mourn the loss of the years she could have had. She died at age 58. Surely kept a little bit longer, so much great work. But these women did have their time and their place, and they had it because of their own talents, their own perseverance for an art form that they loved and wanted to succeed in. And they pushed aside societal norms with their own perseverance, but also with the help of their family and friends. And I love that this book was written to help celebrate many, many other women in many other places in Indiana who show us that we too can find our time and our place to celebrate our own art, our own way of making life better. So I hope I've inspired you to go to Brown County, to go to the Art Guild, to read this book, to read many more books, and to learn more about this treasure that we have just down the road. Thank you very much.